1, 2, 3, 4.
Hi, and welcome to the Vininspo podcast with me, Ed Merrison. This is where wine is a travel experience. Join us as we pick up bits and pieces, make new friends, and create memories that make our future interactions with wine, people, and places all the more meaningful and fun. My guest on this week's podcast is Lorraine Leheny. With her husband, Warren Gibson, Lorraine is owner and vigneron at Bilancia in Hawke's Bay on the North Island of New Zealand. Lorraine and I only actually met a few weeks ago at a tasting of wines from Two Terraces Vineyard. I recommend you head to my Substack to read an uplifting piece on this thriving, talented community. On that note, if you like thriving communities more than zombie wastelands, please consider sharing, commenting on, subscribing to, or in any way engaging with content that you think deserves to be read, heard, and seen. Anyway, Lorraine and I spoke about how to tell your tutai kuri from your tuki-tuki, the Margaret River sliding doors moment, Hawke's Bay's mysterious ways with multiple grapes, and why La Collina Syrah is such a star, who holds the balance of power when your partner in life and wine is a fellow Libran, Sauvignon Blanc before Oyster Bay came out of its shell, tractors, trailers, and forthright trailblazers in the Yarra Valley, why New Zealand fine wine must hold the line, when it rains on your parade in Porto and you have to declare a vintage a damp squib, blowing up the mainstream beer scene with Dogs and Dynamite, and being the best-kept 30-year-old secret in your region. I started by asking Lorraine how a nice young Catholic girl got herself mixed up in all this business.
I grew up in Melbourne. I'm one of 5 children, the second youngest, 3 girls, 2 boys. But of the 5 of us, I was the only one who was born in Canberra. It was just a very short stint that my family lived there. And they moved back to Melbourne where my younger sister was born. Grew up in West Coburg, so quite close to the CBD. Went to school in West Coburg for primary school and then went to high school in North Melbourne all the way through and finished my HSC. And in fact, I was just thinking the other day, it was a long time ago, that was in 1980. And a couple of days before I met you in Melbourne, I just had lunch with all of the girls who were my close friends from school. So 46 years later, we're still all there and we all still catch up. So I'm the only one who lives in a different country. I didn't grow up in a family of wine, but I studied food technology, or it was called rural product technology because I studied in Ballarat, which is now, I think, a part of the Melbourne University. I did an undergraduate in a Bachelor of Applied Science, majoring in what is, I guess, food science, food technology. But I was always interested in fermentation, and I'm particularly interested in brewing, but I always thought brewing, winemaking and cheese making were things that interested me. So that was in the early 80s, and my first job out of university was working for a place in Richmond that made frozen Chinese food. I was part of their quality control department, and I realised after a while that just wasn't me. I wasn't good at that sort of job, and so I was lucky enough to be given the opportunity in 1985. I was offered the assistant brewer's job at a brand new project in North Fitzroy, which was the Loaded Dog Pub Brewery, and that got me started on the brewing slant.
And from those young ages, I guess from a relatively large, I guess for a Catholic family of the time, 5 of you was not necessarily a big family, but still, I guess within a pecking order in a way, and then through your student years, what was your temperament like? Were you quite quiet? Did you hide? Did you try and stand out?
In my family, anyone will tell you that I was probably the one who caused the least amount of distress. I think that's my Libran personality, in that you tend to sit on the fence a little bit. Although in saying that, of the 5 kids, 3 of us are Librans, but I was a fairly quiet personality. I was never one for standing out and making bold statements about anything, I think. I just got down and did what I needed to do. I was an average student. I wasn't a great student, but I managed to get by, and that was me.
Fermentation seems like an interesting thing to take hold of. COVID seemed to be, for some reason, a bit of a golden age of general curiosity in all things fermented. But back in your day, it seems like an odd thing to really latch onto. What was that all about, do you reckon? Was food a big part of the upbringing?
I'm not sure. We always, not so much eating out, not so much anything formal, but my mother always made sure that we ate well. And as we got a bit older, then we experimented a little bit. You know, growing up in Melbourne, the Greek capital, the Italian capital, particularly in West Coburg. So a lot of, I guess, influences with that regard. I was thinking about it the other day about our Italian neighbours and the whole, at the time I thought they were making tomato sauce in beer bottles, but they were, every year they would go through and make their passata, which was totally unheard of for us. But I think that probably opened up a little bit of insight. But I've always enjoyed food and I experiment quite a lot in that I find recipes that I want to make. And so maybe it was just all a part of that. I was never a big beer drinker. I just liked the idea of making the product. And I think my idea of the product was more about not so much the regular product, but something new and interesting.
It's interesting you say that about the immigrants, because I remember Kathleen Quealy, another great Catholic name. She was on the podcast. She grew up in outer burbs of Sydney. But she said kind of the same thing, actually, surrounded by lots of immigrants and being just massively inquisitive about what they were making, what they were brewing, what was going on in the house, because they were always making stuff at home.
We had some Greek neighbours who lived 2 doors down from us, who their mother at evening time, their kitchen always smelt amazing. But it was never ever something we had at home, so I wished I'd probably learned to appreciate it even more when I was a kid. But yeah, those things I think do play a bit of influence or give you a bit of influence on what you're doing.
Yes, and for a kind of Libran peacekeeper keeping out of trouble, it sounds almost a bit bold being in a brewing environment, just because beer in general probably has been perceived as being a bit of a blokey environment. Was it a stimulating, eye-opening time?
It was brilliant. It was great to be a part of it. At the time in Victoria, Carlton United Breweries was the king of the brewing industry, and every pub in Melbourne served Carlton Draft on tap, and there was very little opportunity to buy anything else. And the guys that I worked with, it was the first pub brewery in the eastern states. One of the guys having worked with Phil Sexton at the Sail and Anchor and Matilda Bay. So they came back to Melbourne with a view to do the same thing. The guy who had worked as a brewer with Phil, Tony, he offered me the job as assistant brewer. And that was nepotism or just lucky. It was somebody that I knew that could get me in at the ground floor, because I think that it would have been quite difficult. I never saw it as being groundbreaking as a woman in the industry. I just was an opportunity for me to do what I wanted to do. That was brilliant. And it was exciting to be a part of it, because the pub was the place to be, and it was just a whole new concept that people were taking on. I guess it was the first iteration of the boutique brewing industry. In those days, it was more about cask conditioned and draft beer, as opposed to these days about bottled and cans. And we made real ales. We made cask conditioned real ales, and in a very traditional manner.
Yes, coming from that background, or those guys coming from Phil Sexton, kind of serial innovator, I guess, in the drink space with Matilda Bay, Little Creatures, things that have since become seen, I guess, as mainstream, but in the time were disruptors really within the industry. As you say, the pub was the place to be. There would have been a fairly creative and I imagine dynamic feel around doing something new, swimming against the tide, and having a real buzz around that scene.
Absolutely. Since our chat the other day, I had a look and had a bit of a catch-up about some of the stories and the articles that were written, and it really was innovative. It was brand new. Just things like, so not only did we serve our own beer on tap, of which there are a number of different, variations, it was the first pub outside of South Australia to serve Coopers on tap. I remember the Coopers kegs, the really big 82-litre kegs coming in and having to be stored on their heads so that just before you speared them, you had to roll them over so that they served cloudy at the bar. And they sold heaps. And it wasn't just that, they had a few other beers on tap. I think at the Loaded Dog, for a little while they actually pulled Carlton Draft off the bar. There were, a few repercussions with that, so it went back on for a while. But it certainly wasn't the biggest selling beer at the bar. It also gave them an opportunity, I guess, to bring in or to maintain some of their older customers, because it was a really big old pub that had a lot of regulars, so trying to keep across both new and old.
Yes, and again, going from that model of, I guess, CUB, Carlton United Breweries, mainstream sort of picture, I gather as well there was a little bit more of a nod to other cultural references with the pubs, with the names and other things. Just tell me a little bit about those, because they've got a nice little Aussie resonance.
Yeah, they do. The pub in North Fitzroy was called the Loaded Dog, formerly the Aberdeen Hotel. It was a Victorian hotel built in the 1880s, I think. But the Loaded Dog is a short story by Henry Lawson about guys who are trying to fish with dynamite, and their dog runs away with dynamite and takes it into the local pub, carries the dynamite in its mouth into the local pub. And there was a statue, a 6-foot statue, leaning up against the bar of a dog in, khaki shorts and a blue singlet with dynamite in his back pocket, holding a large stein of beer, which I think often late at night when people were at the bar gave them a bit of a fright when they bumped into it and realised what it was. And then we commissioned... They bought the Auburn Hotel in Hawthorne, and we commissioned the brewery for that. That was something that I was involved in, which was also quite exciting. But they changed the name to the Geebung Polo Club, which is a poem by Banjo Patterson. Somewhere up the country in a land of rock and scrub, they formed an institution called the Geebung Polo Club. So they're very Australian, and both pubs ended up looking very similar on the interior, but sort of pulled them back to some of their traditional, particularly with their painting in heritage colours. They then, after my time though, or just as I was departing, they bought a hotel in Kensington, which was called the Dudagalla, and they closed that down completely for renovations. And when they renamed it, it was called the Sydney Liars Club, which is actually a contemporary poem. And the statue in that was actually 3. It was Malcolm Fraser, Gough Whitlam and Sir John Kerr all standing together having a beer, which is obviously a big lie, because never would those 3 politicians be in the same place sharing a beer. So, there was always this play and this interaction with the arts as well, I suppose.
Yeah, and building a bit of an identity and a bit of a tribe around it, which is probably a little bit avant-garde in the beer scene at the time. Do you still drink beer? Are you still interested in beer?
Yeah, I do. I haven't made beer for a while. I tend to not drink a lot of beer, but I've always been a big fan. Discovered a very big liking for Guinness and a few other bits and pieces, but these days, probably when I do, it will be more wine than beer, but I will, on a really hot day, enjoy a beer as well.
Very good. And so how did that turn from beer to wine?
I was always interested in wine, obviously the fermentation side of it, but I was also a consumer, but a really entry-level consumer in those years. And I got to a point where I felt that it was time for me to do something different. I had enjoyed the process and the learning process of the brewery and when I was involved in that business, but I took the opportunity to apply to Roseworthy Agricultural College to do the graduate diploma, postgraduate in winemaking. I was accepted, although my original intention was to do the undergraduate and hopefully get some exemptions, but a few issues with that in that, yes, they could give me exemptions, but not from a whole lot of it, and I would still take 3 years to do it. This one was 1 year. So that's what I did. I applied and I went back to study in 1990 at Roseworthy. So I moved to South Australia for a year.
Right. And so for a year in a slightly different course from what you were hoping to do with those exemptions, did that leave you isolated from the main group of undergraduates?
Oh, goodness, no. It was, I was thinking about it this morning and I was thinking, I imagined that I would go and I was taking a year out of my life and I was going back to study and it was going to be a really serious year. God, it was so much fun. But yes, we learned, but probably a lot of the learning happened with the people that we met along the way. And as the postgraduate students, particularly the first semester, most of our subjects were, or a lot of our subjects were with the second years. So the third years at that point were doing their required harvest. So they weren't there for the first semester. We were just lucky. The year that I was in, the second years had a lot of mature age students. So a lot of guys, people who'd, been and done things and were there because they were really absolutely determined that this is what they want to do. So it was a really good year to be a part of. It was a whole lot of fun. I met some really amazing people, obviously met Warren, and people who we still keep in contact to this day. Peers, friends, people you bounce ideas off. It was good.
And I suppose in these things, the troublemakers are often the same people who excel in wine school, which isn't always the case in education. But who were the people that you really bonded with at uni?
Okay, obviously Warren, and that's another whole story. But in my year as a postgraduate, people like Brian Bicknell from Mahi here in Marlborough, Rebecca Salmon, who is Odyssey. She's based out of Auckland. A few other people. And then in the second year, Matt Harrop, Tom Carson, there's Nick Delaforce, who's a port winemaker, actually, hoping we're going to see him later this year. There's Herb Friedley, who is on Waiheke Island, and a few other people that we just keep in contact with, who have remained friends. And, when I was in Melbourne the other week, we went out and stayed with Tom and Nadesh out in the Yarra Valley because they're still really good friends and it's great to spend time with them.
Yeah. Was Ginny Wilcock in your year as well?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Ginny was kind of in our year and kind of in the third year. And her partner, Mike, he was in my year. He was postgrad at Roseworthy. There was a few other people who were on the periphery who I don't know so well, but who I've kept in contact with through Warren and other people. We spent, when Tom and Nadesh got married in 2013 in Burgundy, we went with our family to the wedding, and Steve, Panel and Fiona and their kids were there with Tom and Nadesh, and Warren and I and our 6 kids between us spent a week in the Cinque Terre. So we've spent time with these people, and it's quite nice to bounce ideas and just chat to them occasionally.
Yeah, a few good wines been made among that cohort, that's for sure. What about your own harvest experiences from there?
Okay, I obviously had not worked in wineries before, but I did have obviously some practical experience working in the brewery. So my first vintage, once I left Roseworthy, I applied and was given a harvest position at Mount Mary in the Yarra Valley, which was actually at the top of my list of places that I applied for. And I think because I just wanted to be somewhere small, family, I didn't really want to go into a big winery where perhaps I would just end up doing the same thing day in, day out during harvest. I wanted to be able to see a little bit more of what was going on. And that was 1991. And I worked with John Middleton and with Mario Marson. And I lived on site for the 3 months or so that I was involved. It was a wonderful experience. Obviously, they made good wines. Made great wines, still make great wines. And I just got to see all sides of it, and it made me realise that in the long term, the smaller family-owned, not just a job, but part of a lifestyle, is probably where I would have liked to have had. John, I was joking, I told you the other day, how one of the first things that John Middleton made me do was he taught me how to drive a tractor. I grew up in the centre of the city, so not much tractor driving. Taught me how to drive a tractor, but also hitched the trailer on, and taught me how to reverse the tractor with the trailer on, because it was a life skill that I would need. And I've used it many times. So he was a really interesting man, very opinionated, but really enjoyed what he did.
Yeah, cool. And have you stayed in touch with Mario?
I have, yeah. Love it or hate it, these days of social media and all those sorts of things, you do manage to keep in contact with people. I hadn't seen him for quite a while. Obviously, he'd moved to Heathcote. And in 2024, Warren was he went to Heathcote to present a Syrah masterclass while they were doing the Heathcote show. And I went to Melbourne and stayed with family, and then I went to Heathcote for one night. But we drove out to see Mario. And we arrived, and it was brilliant. And Helen and Madeline were there. And, when I last saw Madeline, she was about 2 years old. She did say to me that the night before at the dinner when Warren had been there, she went up to him and she said, "I met you years ago, but I was only about 2 years old." So we caught up with them. They showed us around the winery, and then he gave me Magnum of the 1991 Pinot Noir, Mount Mary Pinot Noir, that obviously was from the vintage that I worked. It was brilliant, actually, because, I don't have any of those wines. And, that stayed in Melbourne for a little while, and then we were in Melbourne for Christmas that year, and we drank it with friends, and it was brilliant. It was great.
Yeah, very cool. I mean, I'm not really sure about the Chinese frozen food factory, which doesn't sound like a whole heap of fun.
It wasn't.
But into brewing and then into Mount Mary, although it's a small winery, it does have an enormous reputation. Through any of those experiences, did you find that you were daunted at all, or did you not really think that way? Did you just get in there and get on with the job and see what happened?
No, I wasn't daunted, actually. I figured that somebody would give me instruction. And can I say it about myself? I'm fairly practical. So I could turn my hand to things. I was at Mount Mary on the weekends if no one was there, and I was doing the pump overs or the plungers and things like that. I would have been daunted had there been no one to show me anything, but I figured that that's what I was there. I was there to learn.
Okay, so that's you finishing after 1 year. You've met Warren already. What happened next then in your career?
Okay, so I left. I did the vintage at Mount Mary, and then I went back to South Australia in the hope of maybe getting a job of some sort. Warren had gone back he was doing his third year. So I thought I'd go to South Australia and I'd see if I could get a job. But didn't have much luck in that regard. But then in the mid-year in 1991, so mid-year through his third year, we came to New Zealand for a 4-week working holiday. He had been and was still working with a winery here, Morton Estate. So we came back to do some work on his mid-year break. And while I was here, I got a job in Auckland at Delegate Winery. Wasn't my intention when I arrived, so I didn't go back to South Australia. I didn't go back to Australia. I took my one bag and moved to Auckland. And again, a great opportunity considering that I had not a lot of experience to be employed as the assistant winemaker, but had people who were willing to show me and take the time. And so I started that in August 1991. Obviously a bigger winery, certainly not as big as Delegates / Oyster Bay is now, but certainly bigger than anything I'd worked with before. And so the 1992 harvest was an interesting time for me because working in a much bigger winery, dealing with much bigger volumes and much bigger tanks, etc. So again, another good learning experience. I really enjoyed my time there. I loved working with the people that I worked with. But again, I got to a point where I realised this wasn't exactly what I wanted to do forever.
So when you were at Delegate, where were they taking their fruit from? What wines were they making and how was that picture shifting?
Okay, take it back a couple of years before I was there, and Delegate Winery, which had been in other ownership, had been bought back into the family by Jim and Rose Delegate, brother and sister, who are still majority shareholders to this day. And so they had brought back their production, and in 1992 we harvested Sauvignon Blanc, Chardonnay, Merlot and Cabernet Sauvignon. And most of that fruit came from Hawke's Bay. There were no vineyards in Auckland. And they took a little bit of fruit from Marlborough, which was the beginning of the Oyster Bay brand. I think in 1992 we harvested about 400 tonne. And it all came to Auckland, either in truck and trailers or hand-picked fruit. Marlborough came as juice. It was crushed and settled in Marlborough. But the Oyster Bay brand at this point, Brent's father was a grape grower in Marlborough, and they decided, Brent and Jim thought it would be good to start making Marlborough fruit. And the idea was, I think, that the Oyster Bay brand was really only destined as an export for the UK. But the 1990 Oyster Bay Sauvignon Blanc won quite a big trophy in London, I think, at the International Wine Competition, possibly. And all of a sudden it was on everybody's radar. Everybody wanted to know about it. And it certainly over the years has become this huge thing. And, you know, they have a winery in Marlborough and they have a winery in Hawke's Bay, and it's quite different to what we did, you know. And I never saw any vineyards in the first year or two because all the fruit just arrived in the back of truck and trailers. Knowing that the fruit was growing in Hawke's Bay, I didn't see any vineyards.
Right. And I don't know if you saw much of Warren at that time. What was he doing in those 4 years you were at Delegate?
Okay, he came back to New Zealand in 1992 for the harvest. He was based in the Bay of Plenty and I was in Auckland, which is about a bit over 2 hours away, south. Then he, post-vintage, he got a flying winemaker position to go to Hungary. And I think I remember you talking with Kim about a flying winemaker position. And then, so for the next 4 years or so, while I was in New Zealand, he was everywhere but New Zealand, because he went from Hungary, then he went to Margaret River, then he went to Italy, then he went back to Margaret River. Then in 1994, we both went to California. So we were in California in Napa together. And then in mid-1995, he was offered the opportunity to become winemaker for a winery that was yet to be built, Trinity Hill in Hawke's Bay, and that was a position that was due to start in time for 1997 harvest. So at that point, I thought it's time for me to do something else. So I quit my job at Delegates and I moved to Margaret River, which is where Warren was. And we were in Margaret River for 9 months. I worked for the first few months in a vineyard planting grapes, and got a job for harvest working at Voyager, which was great. Good. I always tell people that our time in Margaret River, or my time in Margaret River, was like the last time of all care, no responsibility, because, you know, we were just enjoying the lifestyle. And the reality is that we could have stayed in Margaret River. We had a possible opportunity to do what we do in New Zealand, but we chose to come to New Zealand instead. We took our kids back to Margaret River in 2009. and said, our son was 11 at the time, and said to him, you could have grown up here. You could have been here playing Australian rules instead of rugby, which probably would have suited him better. He's not really built for rugby. But, there was just that sliding door moment, and we took the New Zealand option and arrived in New Zealand in January 1997. But in 1996, we both went overseas to do flying winemaker. It was my second flying winemaker position, with a view to coming back to New Zealand to move to Hawke's Bay.
And that was your time in glorious Portugal, was it?
Oh, no, Portugal, sorry, it was 1993. 1993, I was given an opportunity again with Kim to make table wine from port varieties, red port varieties, which I thought was just ideal. It was a project that I thought would be brilliant, but you have to take into consideration that 1993 was one of their worst vintages on record. It just rained constantly. And by the time I got access to any fruit, because the project was based on the fruit that wasn't going to be made into port, by the time I got access to any fruit, it had been well and truly rained on. So it was quite a difficult vintage, but I certainly tried and certainly learned a lot about port. We have a really good friend who's a port winemaker there, so I spent a bit of time with him and got the opportunity to see quite a few port houses and just learn a little bit about that. So there were ups and downs, but I felt it's the challenge of winemaking. You can't predict. The harvest is 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks long. It's not a long time, and it rained pretty much every day.
Yeah, so the key there is don't think you'll track down vintage port from 1993.
Oh, well, it won't be.
And don't go looking for Lorraine's wines from Portugal.
No. To be fair, I'm not really sure of what the final outcome was for the wines. It was a great opportunity, but it is just one of the foibles of winemaking.
Yeah, so then you had a relatively long run-up, I guess, for your beginning in Hawke's Bay, having had Warren offered a job before the job was ready for him. So did your idea of what you were going to do have a bit of a time to sort of take shape, and did you get your heads around the challenge you were taking on?
Yeah, because as I mentioned earlier, there had been a possible opportunity to do something similar in Margaret River, which we didn't do, but it began the seed of we could do something ourselves. So when Warren was offered the job as winemaker for Trinity Hill, part of the deal that he made with John Hancock, who was one of the owners and the chief winemaker, was that we could use Trinity Hill to make our own wine. Both of us being winemakers and John, being the main winemaker for Trinity Hill. So we went overseas at the beginning of 1996, both of us doing flying winemaker jobs, with a view to hopefully storing a little bit of cash so we could come back in 1997 to buy fruit and begin the project, which is exactly what happened.
Very good. And the name comes from not just Italian, but it was also born in Italy, was it not, the name Bilancia?
Yeah, it was. At that time, we had no vineyard, we had no anything really. But Warren was reading his horoscope, attempting, as he says, to read his horoscope when he was on one of the vintages that he worked in Italy. He worked there, I think, 3 times in southern Italy, and he was reading his horoscope, and Bilancia, we're both Librans, and Bilancia is the Italian for the star sign Libra. It's also obviously Italian for balance, harmony and equilibrium. So we just thought it would be a nice term to use, and so that's where it came from.
Very good. So take us now to Hawke's Bay then. As it was then, what was on the radar? I mean, I'm assuming that Trinity Hill would have been a massively exciting project because it had backers and it had a vision behind it and it had been thought out before you needed to dip your own toe in. But what was the scene like? How big was it? Who was making waves? And how well might it have been viewed overseas at that stage?
I think Hawke's Bay there was a lot of new projects in the offing. In the next 5 years after we arrived, Selene, Craigie Range, a couple of others, who started project, obviously Trinity Hill, their project. I think a lot of the historical vineyards had been reworked. If you think about when I worked at Delegates, a lot of the vineyards that were contract vineyards usually carried a lot of different varieties. They were just covering all their bases. And I guess in the mid to late 90s, people started just realising that certain sites were better for certain varieties. So the landscape was changing with regards to fruit that was available, but these newer wineries were also planting the right varieties on the right sites. And you look at Craigie Range with Steve, and you look at the way their vineyards are set out. That was part of it. So tomato was there and always had been and still is, and is a great Hawke's Bay exponent. And there were people like Clearview and a few others. My perception of the overseas market is probably a lot of Hawke's Bay wines and New Zealand wines in the UK, but a lot of the other markets were probably much smaller. Mid to late 90s and the early 2000s was quite a big building time.
And the lay of the land as well is more complex, as everything is in wine, than might be sometimes made out. Could you just give us your way of looking at the geographical overview of Hawke's Bay in terms of its general climatic conditions and the upsides that it gives for potential wine growing, but also a little bit perhaps that sub-regional difference as well that's there?
Yeah, sure. The majority of the Hawke's Bay vineyards is centred around what is the Heretaunga Plains. There are 3 major rivers that run through Hawke's Bay. There are actually 5 of them, but the 3 of them sort of bound the Heretaunga Plains, the Tutaikore, the Nararoro and the Tukituki. And a lot of the area in which the grapes are grown is part of the floodplains of those rivers. Historically, all of those rivers now have stop banks on them, so the sites are no longer floodplains. So you look at things like the Gimlet Gravels, which is the old riverbed of the Nararoro River, 1867 big flood, and when the flood subsided, the river had changed course. And then you move a little bit further inland. There's a road almost that separates from the Gimlet Gravels to the Bridgepath Triangle, which is part of the same gravels underneath, but 10,000 years of topsoil on top of it. So quite different definition to the gravels. Then you move out to the coast where Clearview and where Elephant Hill and a few others have vineyards out there, more affected probably by coastal winds. I want to say breezes, but they're winds. And then you start to move further inland and you go to where the Mangatahi terraces, where Two Terraces are, and then a little bit further down there along the river there to the Moreton Estate Riverview Vineyard, and beyond them you have East Hope, who are also on river terraces. So then you get out at Bayview, which is again more coastal, and then you get people like us who plant on the hillsides, which often a few people refer to it as the Gimlet Gravels, but it's not at all, so we just call it Gimlet Heights. But there's a few vineyards planted on hills around the Heretaunga Plains and the areas beyond that. But you go into Mangatahi, to the Mangatahi terraces, and it's slightly more elevated, a bit more inland. So, it's a little bit cooler than what we would experience either in our vineyard on the gravels. So there are all these different sites that give rise to just slightly different features in what they grow and what they can grow well. And I think that's possibly a good thing and a bad thing for Hawke's Bay with regards to just trying to define styles, but we're working on it.
I'm sure there isn't a consensus, but do you feel like Hawke's Bay vignerons in general have an awareness now of where things would ideally be planted within that picture and how that shifts?
Definitely, and it goes back to what I was saying from some of the historical vineyards, and I think a lot of people who are contract grape growers have realised that as well and have reworked some of their vineyards. There's a lot more clonal material, there's a lot more base material that's available, and that's probably a little bit out of my area of expertise, but it gives people more opportunities to what they can plant in their site. What you would plant on the Gimlet Gravels, you possibly wouldn't plant on somewhere where there's a bit more soil. With certain varieties, I don't think you really would grow Pinot Noir on the Gimlet Gravels, but, you never know, somebody might try. And Chardonnay, you need to pick your sites if you're planting on the gravel, because you're probably looking for a little bit more topsoil, so you find some of those sites that have a little bit more silt that was laid down by the river originally. And I know that some of the wineries, and Trinity Hill, where Warren is, has done that, and that they've reworked some of their vineyards to find the better spots to plant varieties and their spacing and all those sorts of things. The gravels is, that's one area of it. And then you go into the Bridgepath Triangle where, they will grow the same varieties, but you get different characteristics from what you grow on the gravels. And it's just working with those bits and pieces.
Right, and I suppose we're already seeing, and have for some time, Chardonnay being quite different from quite a lot of different areas, and as often happens, there are different tastes that probably lend themselves to appreciating different wines across the Chardonnay picture there. Do you have a sense with Bordeaux varieties and Syrah of them working in the same-ish places, or again, would you make a definition of where's ideally suited to those two sets of grapes?
Yeah, well, Syrah grows well in most places, and Syrah is probably a little bit more forgiving climatically. I think it enjoys having a bit of soil, and the gravels And they've worked this out, years ago, that you don't need to work it too hard once it comes into the winery because it's a pretty tough growing environment. So you get grapes that have quite a bit that they're willing to give up. So you need to work it so that you don't then spend lots of time taking out what you've just spent a lot of time putting in. We grow Syrah on our own vineyard on a hill, and it enjoys the soil. So, we don't have to irrigate. And Cabernet was planted everywhere. I think it's one of the noble varieties, and everybody wanted to grow Cabernet historically. Over the years, you'll find that Cabernet plantings have gone down, but people have picked sites. The sites that have remained are the sites that are the best spots for it. It's obviously grown a lot in the gravels, but then Tomato grow it in different places in the Havelock Hills, and it's grown out on the Bridgepath Triangle where there's a lot more soil, but it's just planted in better places, and it gives you very different wines, And I think that people have worked out that they just need to make sure that it is planted in the right spot, because it is probably the one variety that takes a little bit more time to get it right, and it's the one variety that doesn't show so well if you have a slightly cooler vintage.
Yeah, well, let's focus directly on Bilancia then. What's your rough output in terms of Chardonnay to Syrah to other things?
Okay, it depends on the vintage, but it's usually maybe between 1,200 and 2,000 cases. Depends on harvest. 2024 was a really low crop, so we had really low cases. And of that, it's probably 50-50 Chardonnay and Syrah, again, depending on the year. But the Chardonnay covers 5 different wines, whereas Syrah is 2 or 3 wines, depending on the vintage. We make a little bit of blended white, Uvaggio, which is Viognier, Marsanne, Roussanne, but that's lucky to be 75 cases.
Do you enjoy making that, or is that a bit of a labour of love, or is it a legacy decision thing?
It's a bit of a legacy. Our original own vineyard, where we have Chardonnay planted now, was all planted to Viognier. We got very excited about planting Viognier as the companion variety for Syrah. We started planting our hillside first, and then when we got to the bottom of the hillside, we then planted the flat and the gentle slope with Viognier. Discovered that people weren't as excited about Viognier as we were. So in 2008, we began a project of top grafting and replanting Chardonnay, and miscalculation of the number of vines and things we would need. And so we ended up with 8 rows of Viognier left. So that stayed as the 8 rows of Viognier, while the rest of the vineyard got replanted. And then in 2017, we discovered Eutypa, trunk disease, in those Viognier vines. So we went through and cut them all off to clean wood. Those that grew back stayed as Viognier, and those that didn't, they were pulled out, and either Marsanne or Roussanne were put in those holes. So we ended up with this 8 rows of interplanted Marsanne, Viognier, Roussanne. And so yes, it is, those vines have survived 2 attempts to cull them. They deserve to stay. And we don't make it every year, but we make a really small volume of these wine that is a true field blend. We pick it all together and we make it as a single wine. And it's usually been fermented in really old barrels, and it's between 2 and 3 barrels, depending on the year. Uvaggio is Italian. It means blended as grapes, uva being grape. And so that's where that name comes from. And we enjoy making it. It's something different, and people enjoy it, but we don't make a lot of it.
Okay, on to Syrah then. Let's talk about La Collina itself. Absolute global renown for this Syrah from Hawke's Bay. What is that vineyard like? Why does it suit Syrah? And how has your Syrah journey gone in terms of defining what you can get out of it, what you can portray of Hawke's Bay or your vineyard with that wine?
We bought that property in 1997. It is a hill, as suggests. One side of the hill faces northwestish. The other side faces south, so that has nothing on it. With a view to planting Syrah, which was quite an unusual thing in 1997 to consider. There was a few people making it. Alan Limmer had done quite a bit with Stonecroft, and Trinity Hill had planted some, and I think 97 was their first Syrah that they made. They may have taken a little bit in 1996. Tomato were making Bullnose Syrah. That was off the Bridgepath Triangle, but there wasn't a lot of Syrah planted. But we thought that this site would be good for Syrah. It is a gamble, but you rely on the fact that you have a bit of knowledge and a bit of understanding about what it would do. And so we started planting in 1998. We did it over 3 years, 98, 99, 2000, as funds allowed. And our aim was hopefully to make a brilliant example of Syrah. For the first couple of years, when the vines were very young, we took the fruit and just made wine for us to keep an eye on. And then in 2002, we released the first La Collina Syrah, which was predominantly from the very first vines that we had planted. So still a very young wine. The thing about our vineyard is that in September, October, November, it's really quite windy in Hawke's Bay, and the vineyard faces into the prevailing wind. So during flowering and fruit set, it's a very natural means of keeping fruit low, and we never have to fruit thin, and we rarely have to leaf pluck in that vineyard. If we go back now and we think about how we made it in 2002, it's very different to how we make it these days. And that is just a learning process. That is an understanding of what the vineyard gives us, and it's the vines getting older, and the wine over the years has changed. But it's nice when you do a vertical tasting, which we've done a couple of them in the last couple of years, to see that there has been some change, but each of the wines is still very distinctive and very indicative of the site. So these days we use a lot more, when we can, whole bunch, which was unheard of in 2002. And in fact, the first time we ever did any whole bunch was in 2013, which was pretty much a watershed year for Hawke's Bay Syrah as well, I think. So it's been a learning process. We have a great site for it. It's an unusual site. There's not a lot of Syrah planted on hillsides, and we just keep hoping that it will do what we want it to do. We don't do a lot with it. It's all handpicked. If it's going to be whole bunch, it goes into tank and gets slightly pigeage to break it up a little bit, and then just gets plunged once a day, generally. And we press it off at dryness and it goes to barrel. We don't do a lot of work with it once it's in barrel. And if we had to, we'd pull it out, but we just monitor it, and it works.
It certainly does. It's quite interesting, I think, the Hawke's Bay talent for Syrah, and I'm not going to say that it's uniform across the board, that it's just always magical Syrah, but when it works, there does seem to be this quite interesting balance, I think, of the texture and the fruit weight without leanness, but also tannins, which just feel very happy. It's actually quite surprising, I think, in that style of cooler profile Syrah to have a relatively velvety texture, a northern Rhône-ish kind of spice and savouriness to the wines, but also that ease of tannin in a place that I suppose is still relatively marginal for these things.
I'd argue that it's not super cool in that we can have days in our vineyard, not that it's ideal, but the maximum thermometer, and it's been 37, 38 degrees if it's facing into the sun, but there is some cooling effect of the sun sort of going behind the hills a little bit. Syrah in Hawke's Bay in different sites grows quite differently, and our other experience goes from growing on the gravels. It can be quite a different beast because it just grows in a much tougher environment. Warren has always said that Hawke's Bay Syrah is the one variety that says to people, I'm from here. I am a Hawke's Bay wine. Just those characteristics of the spice, not so much the pepperiness and the often gentle tannins, but gentle, and nice ripeness. We've had years where we've not made La Collina because we weren't happy with what came from the vineyard, but we don't have a lot of issue with what we get ripeness-wise from that site and from most of the Syrah that we deal with.
On to Chardonnay then. You make a few different iterations. Again, how do the wines that you make express the possibilities of Hawke's Bay with Chardonnay from a few different sites?
Yeah, it was a project that started with one single vineyard Chardonnay, which is our own vineyard, and then gradually built. We have access to some really good sites for individual parcels of Chardonnay. And I guess it's part of that Cumia River model where they have done quite well in their single vineyard sites for their Chardonnays. And if you've got people growing good grapes for you, then you want to give those grapes the opportunity to shine. We wouldn't do it if we didn't think that we could produce wines that were distinctive. We make 5 Chardonnays, and one of them is our Bilancia Chardonnay, which is a blend of all the vineyards and bits and pieces. We have the Territoire, which is from our own vineyard, and then we have 3 single vineyards from vineyards that we don't own, which is the Two Terraces, the Kaikorda Vineyard, and the Trilino Vineyard. And we don't do a lot. We handpick it. It's whole bunch pressed, straight to barrel, indigenous ferment, some new oak, quite a bit of older oak, although with some of the smaller volumes, the difference between 1 barrel and 2 barrel goes from 33 to 66% new oak. So that is something you have to work with in vintages like 2024. And some of them full malo, some of them part malo, and then no fining, no cold settling, but they are filtered into bottle. And the idea is to just try and not work them too hard so that you do get an opportunity for the vineyards to shine. obviously, no matter what you do, there is some winemaker influence, but the idea is to just try and keep that at a minimum. From the time that you pick the Chardonnay to the time that the decision that you make to pick it, and then you put it into barrel, you've made your wine. The wine's, it's done. Anything that happens after that is the result of what you've done in the first place. So you make it in the first day or two. And hopefully you make the right decisions with that Chardonnay. And just expressing, but not being too overt in anything. Your name is Bilancia, you've got to hope that your wines are balanced. But giving it some ageability and giving the vineyard some of their own distinction to show through.
Has it changed at all over the years, or have you always embraced that confidence and that flavour that you have because the growing conditions give you a relatively good natural balance with acidity and energy?
I think we've probably changed. When we first came in our first vintage in 1997, we make Chardonnay and we made Merlot, I think. And then we stopped making Chardonnay after 2002 because we felt, or A, we didn't own our own vineyard, so we were relying on access to fruit. And it probably goes back to the same discussion about the right fruit in the right places. So we stopped that, which also prompted the process of planting our own Chardonnay, because we felt that if we were going to do it, we would do it on our own, off our own vineyard. Warren did a lot of wine judging. Not so much me. Warren did a lot of wine judging, and he spent quite a bit of time in Australia. And just with friends, people like Dave Micknell and Steve Flamsteed, and again Jenny and Tom, and just trying lots of Chardonnays that had changed the direction or changed the market and the perception of what people wanted Chardonnay to be. And we just felt that and this is not just us, had got a bit lazy with Chardonnay production. It was just easy to do what you'd been doing. So until we could control the fruit, we felt that we needed to just wait. And so our first Chardonnay from our own vineyard was a very young crop in 2010 from those top grafted Chardonnay, but it just gave us enough to start working with. And we didn't release the first Territoire until 2018, when we felt that the vines had reached enough of an age. They're still not old, but they had reached enough of an age where we could make this single vineyard wine. So previously they'd gone into our Bilancia Chardonnay. So I think it was a confidence thing to plant our own vineyard of Chardonnay, which, in the ideal world we would have done to start with. And we swapped a lot of wines with those guys in Australia and tried a lot of those wines that you couldn't buy here at the time, the Giant Steps and the Oak Ridge, and those wines were groundbreaking, particularly in a New Zealand sense. I think New Zealand was lucky enough to probably not go as far down that austerity track as some of the Australian wines went, but we certainly changed the way that we approached making Chardonnay, and that to be careful of the new oak and to be aware of the acidity in your wine, but you still wanted fruit character, and be aware of the Malo character, and not just using Malo as a means of reducing acidity. In the John Middleton school, where Mount Mary Chardonnay never had any malolactic fermentation, I've always been, if I have malolactic fermentation, I don't want to taste it. It's not a flavour profile for me, it's a palate and a structural thing for me. So, it's just embracing some of those ideas. And I think perhaps just the knowledge that we were taking the lead from other people who had been doing it before us.
Yeah. You mentioned, obviously, the name Bilancia and the fact that you're both Librans. Possibly from what you were saying about the equanimity of that temperament, I don't know if Librans typically do work well together, or whether they're both just saying, no, after you. But how do you...
That's exactly what happens.
It's okay. So how does that dynamic work between you and Warren in terms of what you do? And what's he really good at? And what are you really good at? Where do you meet on those things?
We work well together, and I think we do have that bit of that temperament. What do you think? I don't know. What do you think? As we've got a bit older, it is a little bit easier to, not so much easier, we're just, different ideas are easier. When we first started travelling together, and, what do you want to do? I don't know. What do you want to do? And, working around that. These days, I look after more of I'm in the winery during harvest and in the vineyard during harvest. But most of the time outside of that, I look after the administration, marketing side of our business, which is not actually my forte, but that's what we do. We do everything ourselves. And I've always said Warren is an extremely skilled winemaker. We work well together, and I understand where his skills are. He's very good, has a great palate, and is very good at making those decisions. But all of our blending decisions, all of our discussions, we do together. And I'll go into the winery and, I will offer my opinion and we'll work well together. But I do generally think that his strength is his understanding what the wines are doing. And I just help to complement that, I hope.
And when it comes to the trajectory of Bilancia, like people getting to know the winery and you becoming comfortable, I guess, with those decisions and with the difficulties of running a small business, how has that arc kind of looked for you guys? Sure, it's never been easy, but have there been times where you've sort of settled into a groove where you're like, this is working out really well? And does that Trinity Hill side of things kind of give you a nice safety net, I suppose, where you're learning all the time and experimenting all the time, but getting all that feedback without all of your risk involved?
Yeah, it does. I think if it's just the two of you, you run the risk of becoming quite insular. So Warren gets to work with a whole lot of other people. He also has a couple of consulting roles which give another insight into different areas. I don't think we ever sit back where, this year we took some Grenache during the harvest this year, some fruit, which is you could sit back and do what you've been doing for years, and because we're getting older and it's time to just rest on your laurels. But this year someone had some Grenache, some really good Grenache, and we just thought, oh, that's something different, let's do that. And so then you reach out to people that who make it. Tom, what do you do with Grenache? And Steve Pannell, what do you do with Grenache? So they're parts of the learning curve. So there is part of it, and I don't think we ever sit still with our winemaking. Every vintage is different, so every vintage asks you different questions. Every vineyard asks you different questions. So I think we're still working with it. We're doing well in that people like our wines and we're getting a bit of recognition for them. We often joke that we're Hawke's Bay's best kept 30-year-old secret. This year was our 30th vintage, which is a bit scary actually. You think that you're not getting old, but it sounds old. So I think we're all still learning. We're not resting on our laurels, and I think that every vintage we try to make sure that, perhaps it's just a little bit better than the one before.
I'm sure Cyclone Gabrielle would have been one of the largest setbacks for the region, but on a personal and regional basis, what else has come up that's really scared the hell out of you?
The reality is that, as I said before, that sales and marketing is not what we do well, so that's a non-stop learning process. Cyclone Gabrielle was difficult, although for us it wasn't as hard as it was for a whole lot of other people, and I think people are still feeling the effects of that today. There have been a couple of vintages, 11 and 12, where you thought 11 was really bad until you got 12, and 12 was just cold and wet. It was a bit like 23, except without the cyclone, but lots of rain. So those sorts of challenges, and you make bold decisions. We didn't pick La Collina in 11 or 12 or 22 or 2023, and so those sorts of things, you make those decisions. I guess just keeping on top of things.
What do you find inspiring about your fellow New Zealanders, and who are those that you kind of speak to and pick the brains of? Even within the community, you're always ploughing your own furrow to a certain degree. So I just wondered who else in that picture has been an inspiration for your wines, but also for running a small business and having the imagination and the motivation to keep going with it.
Hawke's Bay is lucky in that it's a combination of people who've been here doing what we do for a while, and I guess you could put it into that more traditional camp of winemaking, and then you have a whole generation of people who are doing new and different things and different varieties, and there is a lot of discussion amongst people. It's hard to pick out any one particular person who we might talk to, but you'll generally find there'll be someone you can ring if you need to ask about something that's happening. You'll get together, you'll be somewhere having a drink or having dinner, and you'll be talking about who's doing what and where. Steve Smith, he's a man with ideas, and he's always good to talk to. He's forever thinking about the next thing, and so that's quite inspiring. And we're lucky, Warren does quite a bit of work with him, and so that's quite good. Within Hawke's Bay, I can't really pick out people individually. I'd say that we probably spend a lot of time talking to a lot of people. And I go back to people like, Tom Carson, who we spend quite a bit of time with, and a lot of discussion about what they do, particularly with Syrah and just who's doing what. And Steve Flamstead, we had a joint project with Steve and Dave McIntosh back in 10, 11 and 12. They wanted Hawke's Bay Syrah for their Salo label, and so we had Yarra Valley Chardonnay for us here. So, some of those guys who just seem to be always on the cusp of something new are quite good to spend some time with.
And when it comes to going into trade, even if you don't think it's your forte, traveling, going to market, speaking to somms, speaking to customers, is it something that you've come to feel more comfortable with? At the end of the day, you need those people who are going to love your wines and take your wines and share your wines. Is that something that you've got better at, or you found easier now?
Definitely. I did a little bit of it when I was in the brewery, just because was people who wanted to come in and do tastings and dinners and things. I didn't do it so much when I was working for delegates, but certainly since we've been here in Hawke's Bay and with our own brand. And I think it has got easier so long as people remind me to slow down and finish my sentences. I think people generally come to a tasting because they're interested. And I think hopefully we can give them something interesting, confidence in the product that I'm showing them, and also not talking down to people, just this is what we do. And hopefully you'll enjoy it. It's not meant to be hard. It is just meant to be enjoyed.
Yeah, well, we met when you were on actually what I thought was a really impressive kind of trade roadshow for Hawke's Bay and also the Two Terraces Vineyard. The community, as I've said, behind that Two Terraces Vineyard was really quite striking. I have been to other projects that have, had a collaborative feel about them, but it was really quite remarkable, that affection that everyone had, both for the place, but also the work that everyone did to make good stuff and grow good grapes was really impressive. But what about Hawke's Bay itself? Do you find now when you travel there is a really good awareness of where you're from? I mean, someone at that tasting said to me, we start sometimes with, we're from New Zealand. Well, where's that? So it's just a reminder that, that your region is sometimes not the first thing on their mind, or your vineyard. But has that awareness jumped up? How do you get received by other people?
It is still on a world stage. Australia's probably a little bit different because they're maybe a little bit more mindful of New Zealand and Hawke's Bay. But on a world scale, one can't argue that people know where Marlborough is, and people know or they've heard of Marlborough. Not so much Hawke's Bay. And, Hawke's Bay, halfway down the east coast of the North Island. So you do have to work with that. You find that people are wanting to try your Sauvignon Blanc first, and it's actually, we don't make Sauvignon Blanc, but this is what we do. And
okay, I'll have the Pinot then.
Yeah, don't do that either. So those things are things that you work on, but that's the challenge. It is still difficult, I think, but it's nice to see when people work together so we can show them that Hawke's Bay, because at the end of the day, in the whole of New Zealand's production, Hawke's Bay is the second largest producer, but still smaller by a long shot, and not a lot about that is going to change in the short term. Probably not even in the long term. Yeah, work on people discovering where Hawke's Bay is and your wines from Hawke's Bay and being passionate about Hawke's Bay. I've got my fist up there. I remember reading that when you said, and New Zealand, Hawke's Bay, and then you can talk about the different areas because we grow grapes from different areas, but I think then it's about pushing your brand as being part of Hawke's Bay.
And what about fine wine itself? It's obviously not a time of great optimism in the wine scene in general, or in almost anything you might name about the world right now. But how do you sort of see the picture for fine wine? I mean, you have to stay motivated, you have to really believe in what you're doing, and you have to believe there's a future. So what does that look like for you, kind of keeping engaged in the idea that this is something worth doing?
If you build it, they will come. I think we need to stay the line and try not to compromise what you're doing. I think there is a balance or a redress happening with regards to volumes, but I think there's always a market for fine wine. And I think it is tough, and it's probably going to get a bit tougher before it gets easier. And I think we just need to stay the line and just keep doing what we're doing. Don't try to fit in with everybody else. And I think that's something that, Hawke's Bay, when we showed at those tastings, I think that's what all those guys are doing. We're all doing is trying to do what we do well, without having to drop our standards. Because at the end of the day, our own vineyards and the vineyards that we buy fruit from, we can't justify going down the scale. So we have to stay where we are. I'd like to think that there will always be a market for fine wine. I will argue that I'm pleased that we've got 30 years behind us and we're not starting now, because I think that's not easy. Some of these guys are doing really good things. So hopefully between us all, we'll stay where we are. There's a few grief stories. There's a few more stories out of Hawke's Bay this week, big wineries, big companies selling assets, which is not any of us who were at that tasting. So I think all just need to stick together.
Yeah, well, certainly there was a lot of dynamism, a lot of energy, and a lot of smiling, a lot of warmth, which I think is also really important to both feel that yourself, but also convey to other people. And for you, born in Canberra, one of 5 kids, raised in the Melbourne suburbs, ending up in a brewery and then going on through life, does it feel a bit strange ever when you think about where you've come from, where you are now as a sort of a slightly internationally connected trailblazer trailblazer within a certain region of New Zealand for wine.
I would never have imagined this. When I finished high school, I would never have imagined that this is where I would be, let alone in New Zealand. I hadn't travelled outside of Australia until my first visit to New Zealand in 1990, so my first passport, which possibly in those days wasn't that unusual. You know, my younger sister had done a lot of travel and my older sister had done a lot of travel, but I had not. I'd stayed at home. But there is no way I thought that I would end up here. I guess it's that whole thing that, you know, when I started doing this, I didn't think any further than where was the next vintage coming from. It's been really good, and I can't imagine myself having done anything else now, and keep doing it, I suppose, until I find some point in my life when I'm going to retire.
Well, it's got to be said, you know, peering into Italian kitchens, watching, you know, tomato sauce being concocted or whatever it is. That curiosity's taken you quite a long way and shown you some pretty cool things, I'd say.
Yeah, and I guess I've been lucky in that regard, in that I've had a number of opportunities given to me that I've been able to make the most of. When I worked at Delegates, you know, a couple of vintages going overseas, travel, and, you know, winemaking is one of those employments or one of those things that can take you to any country in the world. And you go into a winery and you say to people, oh, hi, I'm just here, I'm a winemaker from New Zealand. And they will take you in like your family. If you tried to ask them about their marketing and sales secrets, they wouldn't talk to you. But any winemaker anywhere will take you in and show you their wine. And so it's been a brilliant, and it is still a brilliant journey. And we're traveling a little bit later this year, and I know that we're going to go and see a few wineries and a few people. And I would never have imagined that back when I left high school.
That's it for this week's podcast. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe and share it everywhere. Please don't underestimate the power of these endorsements in making it possible to produce original, thoughtful work. You can also subscribe to my Substack, that's edmerison.substack.com. For now, I'd like to say thank you to Lucas James for the music, Neil Williams for the artwork, Patricio Garcia for additional editing, and to my guest, Lorraine Leheny of Bilancia. Till next time, live wine to the fullest. Cheers!